Paul McCartney has said many times that no matter how famous he became, no matter how many records he sold or stadiums he filled, inside he was still that same boy from Liverpool, still amazed that people listened to his songs at all. Fame never erased that sense of disbelief. When he talks about himself, he doesn't sound like a billionaire or a legend. He sounds like someone who stumbled into something magical and never quite figured out why it happened to him. Even now, decades after the screaming crowds and historic records, Paul describes his private life as surprisingly ordinary, relaxing at home, watching television, enjoying quiet moments, because emotionally, he never stopped being that kid who grew up with very little but learned early how powerful music could be when life hurt. Growing up in the shadow of war, Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, in Liverpool, England, at a time when the city still carried the scars of World War II. Buildings were broken, neighbourhoods were struggling, and families were simply trying to survive. Paul's home was modest, crowded, and often short on money, but it was rich in warmth. His father, Jim McCartney, worked hard to support the family and played jazz piano whenever he could, while his mother, Mary, was a nurse who held the household together through discipline, love, and quiet strength. Music filled their small home, not as ambition, but as comfort. And laughter mattered just as much as survival. Paul didn't grow up dreaming of wealth or fame. He grew up learning that joy could exist even when circumstances were difficult. The loss that changed everything. In 1956, when Paul was just 14 years old, his life was permanently altered when his mother died suddenly from breast cancer. One moment she was there, guiding and protecting him, and the next she was gone. Paul later described it as a shock that never truly faded, a wound that shaped his emotional world forever. He didn't have the language to process grief at that age, so he carried it quietly, letting it sink deep into his identity. The loss created a hole that music would later fill, not by fixing the pain, but by giving it somewhere to live. That absence of a mother's voice, touch, and reassurance became one of the most powerful emotional forces behind Paul's songwriting. Music as a way to survive. After Mary's death, Paul's father encouraged him to focus on music, not as a career plan, but as a way to cope. Paul learned guitar, practiced endlessly, and discovered that melodies could express feelings he didn't know how to say out loud. Music became a safe place where grief could exist without explanation. Around this same time, Paul met another teenager from Liverpool named John Lennon, who had also lost his mother. Their bond formed almost instantly, built on shared pain and a shared sense that the world had taken something from them too early. Together, they found comfort in songwriting, sitting in small rooms, writing lyrics that were honest because they came from loss. Two broken boys and a dream Paul, and John weren't polished or confident when they started writing together. They were just two young men trying to make sense of their emotions through sound. They didn't believe they were special, and no one around them expected much. Liverpool wasn't known for producing global stars, and poverty was a constant backdrop. Yet something extraordinary happened when they played together. Their harmonies felt natural, their creativity effortless. What began as an escape from grief slowly turned into a shared dream. They formed a band with other local teenagers, unaware that history was quietly taking shape around them, learning the hard way in Hamburg. Before success arrived, the band travelled to Hamburg, Germany, where they performed long, exhausting sets in small clubs. The conditions were rough. Tiny rooms, constant noise, little rest. But the experience transformed them. Night after night, they played for audiences who didn't care if they were tired or inexperienced. This period forced them to grow stronger, tighter, and more confident as musicians. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Paul later acknowledged that without Hamburg, they would never have become who they were. It was there that they learned discipline, resilience, and how to survive under pressure. Losing a friend. Too soon. Just as the band began to find its footing, tragedy struck again when their close friend and original bassist, Stuart Sutcliffe, died suddenly at just 21 years old. His death deeply affected Paul, bringing back memories of losing his mother and reinforcing how fragile life could be. Paul took over the bass role out of necessity, even though it reminded him daily of his lost friend. Once again, grief became intertwined with music. Instead of stopping, Paul pushed forward, believing that continuing was the only way to honor those who were gone. When the world exploded by 1963, the Beatles became a global phenomenon almost overnight. Screaming crowds, non-stop travel, and constant attention turned their lives upside down. Paul was barely in his 20s, suddenly one of the most recognized faces on the planet. While the world celebrated Beatlemania, Paul struggled quietly with the pressure. Fame felt unreal and overwhelming, and privacy disappeared completely. The joy of making music began to mix with exhaustion and loneliness. Still, the band continued to create songs that would define generations, pouring their emotions into melodies that felt timeless. Songs that carried pain and hope. Many of Paul's most famous songs were shaped by loss, longing, and reflection. Yesterday captured sadness in a way that felt universal. Let It Be drew directly from dreams of his mother, offering comfort rather than despair. These songs weren't written to impress. They were written to heal. Paul never approached songwriting as a display of genius, but as an emotional outlet. That honesty is what made the music resonate so deeply with people who were going through their own struggles. When leadership became a burden. After the death of the band's manager, Brian Epstein, tension within the Beatles grew. Paul tried to keep the group together by taking on more responsibility, but his efforts were often misunderstood. What he saw as care, others saw as control. Creative differences turned personal, and the closeness that once defined the band began to fade. Paul felt trapped between wanting to protect the group and watching it slowly fall apart. The pressure was immense, and the emotional cost was heavy. The end of a family in 1970, the Beatles officially broke up, shocking the world and devastating Paul. The band had been his emotional home since his teenage years, and losing it felt like losing a family. Public reaction was intense, and much of the blame was unfairly placed on Paul. He retreated from the spotlight, questioning his talent, his identity, and whether music still had a place in his life. For the first time, silence replaced applause, falling apart to rebuild. Paul withdrew to his farm in Scotland, struggling with depression and self-doubt. Days blurred together, and music felt distant. But slowly, creativity returned, not as confidence, but as necessity. Paul recorded a solo album largely on his own, experimenting without expectations. Critics were harsh, but the process helped him reconnect with why he loved music in the first place. It wasn't about approval, it was about expression. Love as an anchor, Linda McCartney. Linda McCartney entered Paul's life at a moment when he needed stability most. Their relationship was grounded, private, and deeply supportive. Linda didn't want fame. She wanted a family. She learned music to stand beside Paul, even when critics mocked her. Together, they built a life centered on love, children, and shared values. For Paul, Linda became the emotional safety he had lost as a teenager. Proving himself again with Wings. Paul formed a new band, Wings, not to replace the Beatles, but to move forward. The early years were difficult, filled with skepticism and criticism. But Paul persisted, believing in growth over perfection. Eventually, Wings found success, proving that Paul could thrive creatively on his own. It wasn't about competing with the past. It was about survival and renewal. Losing Linda and facing old fears. In the mid-1990s, Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer, the same illness that took Paul's mother decades earlier. Watching his wife suffer reopened wounds he thought had healed. When Linda passed away in 1998, Paul was devastated. Grief returned in waves, stronger than ever. Music became painful, memories overwhelming. Yet even in loss, Paul honored Linda by supporting causes she cared about and keeping her spirit alive through action. Learning that grief changes shape, Paul eventually found love again, though later relationships came with different challenges. Public scrutiny made healing harder, but time taught him that loss doesn't disappear. It transforms. Each experience left scars, but also wisdom. Paul learned that grief doesn't mean weakness. It means love mattered, still standing at 83. Today, Paul McCartney continues to perform, write, and create. At 83, he worries about memory and time, but he refuses to stop moving forward. Music keeps him grounded, connected to the voices and faces he fears forgetting. His legacy isn't measured in wealth or records, but in resilience. What Paul McCartney teaches us. Paul's life shows that strength isn't about avoiding pain. It's about continuing despite it. He turned loss into art, heartbreak into connection, and uncertainty into creativity. The boy from Liverpool never disappeared. He simply learned how to keep going. And through his music, he reminds millions that even after everything is taken from you, something beautiful can still remain.